In the 1930s, a very peculiar case caught the attention of the residents of Colorado. Joe Arridy had been sentenced to death, but because of his mental disability, he could not understand or follow the court proceedings which had led to his conviction. As he could not understand the concept of death, the young man, at 23 years old, was considered by many to be the happiest man on death row. This is a delicate case, which invites close consideration of the treatment given to people with psychological disabilities by the criminal justice system. It is worth highlighting that in this case, Joe was most probably innocent of the crime he was accused of. This is the story of Joe Arridy, who became known as the happiest man on death row. Joe Arridy was born on April 29, 1915, in Pueblo, Colorado, United States. Since childhood, it was clear that he had learning disabilities. His behavior fell outside what was considered normal at the time. In a psychological evaluation, Joe's IQ was scored at 46, well below the average. Despite his disability, he was a very happy young man. Unfortunately, his difficulty in understanding made it hard for him to do simple things like school activities, or to recognize the difference between an egg and a stone. His parents, Henry and Mary Arridy, were cousins. Several of Joe's brothers died shortly after birth, and one of those who survived was both mentally and physically disabled. The brothers' disabilities were most likely due to their parents' consanguinity. Joe spoke very slowly, was colorblind, and had difficulty completing simple tasks of reasoning such as stating where he was born or where he was going. At the age of 10, he was admitted to a state school for training the physically and mentally handicapped in the state of Colorado, but he constantly ran away and was unable to keep quiet. The school principal said that Joe was easily coerced into admitting guilt for things he hadn't done. His peers once made him confess that he had stolen a pack of cigarettes when he had not done so. His parents reported that as a teenager, he sometimes spent days away from home wandering around. He would later return, but would be unable to say where he was. Joe always had difficulty making friends, but it seemed that for him, he just lived within himself. And as I said, he never stopped smiling. On the night of August 15th, 1936, the parents of sisters Dorothy Drain, 15, and Barbara Drain, 12, arrived home. They found Barbara crying desperately and unable to speak. Her parents then discovered Dorothy lying on the floor, a pool of blood forming around her body, the result of a powerful axe blow to her head. The police arrived, and Barbara explained with great difficulty that her sister and her had been raped by a man, who then struck them both on the head with an axe. By some miracle, she had survived. The attack on the young women caused uproar in the city and led newspapers to declare that a murderer and sexual pervert was on the loose. The police were pressured to approach and interrogate any foreign-looking man who matched the description given by two girls. They claimed to have been approached by this sex maniac not far from the house where the crimes occurred. The police were under enormous pressure to capture the killer. Days later, Sheriff George Carroll received an anonymous tip that Joe Arridy, then 21 years old, had been seen wandering aimlessly along the local railways on the day of the incident. The police immediately set out to arrest him. Joe's parents were Syrian immigrants, and this contributed to his appearance being described as foreign, similar to that described by the victims. Whether or not the police knew about Joe's disability, which caused him to be easily influenced to admit to things he didn't do, the sheriff, desperate for an answer, didn't bother to write down his statement and just asked direct questions that encouraged Joe to give a specific answer. For example, the sheriff asked Joe if he liked girls, and Joe replied, "Yes, they are my friends." Then the sheriff said, "If you like them, why do you hurt them?" Joe didn't understand what was going on. He would smile and answer yes to questions, then answer no, then smile again. His testimony changed often depending on who was questioning him and the manner in which he was being asked. He clearly did not know even the most basic details about the crime. For example, he did not know who the victim was. After this prejudiced interrogation, and with no expert summoned who could question a person with special needs, Joe Arridy was arrested on charges of sexual abuse and murder. His parents were devastated. Weeks later, following further complaints, the police arrested Frank Aguilar for the crime that Joe Arridy was accused of. Aguilar was Mexican and perfectly matched the girl's description of the attacker. Furthermore, Barbara, the survivor of the Drain family, identified him. In his statements, Frank confessed to being responsible for this crime. In addition, he was already wanted for several crimes that included drugs, weapons, and sexual abuse. It didn't take long for the court to make a judgment, and he was sentenced to death, but it was already too late for public opinion. It began to circulate in the city that the two men had worked together. The locals didn't want Joe released. During Joe's hearings, 3 psychiatrists testified on his behalf to confirm his mental disability. The core of Joe's defense was that he was not legally sane, had difficulty distinguishing between right and wrong, and was therefore unable to perform any action with criminal intent. However, this was the argument that the prosecution was relying on. Joe had joined Aguilar as an accomplice to the crime because he did not understand the difference between right and wrong. Even with the defense's request that Joe be admitted to a psychiatric clinic, pressure from society meant that Joe was sentenced to death by cyanide gas. His parents and family were devastated and lost, but they were powerless to do anything to stop this. A lawyer named Gail Ireland offered Joe pro bono legal counsel and asked the Colorado Supreme Court that Joe's case be dismissed or at the very least reviewed. Seeking to overturn Joe's conviction, Ireland called for a stay of execution. According to him, if Joe was killed, it would take a long time for the state of Colorado to live down the disgrace. Once on death row, Joe couldn't fully understand the concept of death. The prison governor Roy Best reported that Joe was the happiest man he had ever seen on death row. When he was informed of the date of his execution, January 6th, he just thanked the governor and continued to play with his train. He seemed much more interested in playing than in his fate. When the date arrived, Joe was asked what he would like for his last meal. He chose strawberry ice cream. After his meal, Joe was taken from his cell. In the hallway, he asked one of his friends who knew what was about to happen to take care of his train. He gave the toy to his friend and said, "When I come back, we can play together." Joe was taken to the gas chamber. He continued to smile, unaware of what was about to happen. His execution was quick. Governor Roy was upset and was reluctant to carry it out. But unfortunately, by law, Joe had been convicted of murder. If the governor had refused to carry out the execution, he would have had to suffer the legal consequences. In 2011, more than 7 decades after his execution, Governor Bill Ritter Jr. granted Joe a state pardon. He said that pardoning Joe Arridy could not undo the tragic event in Colorado's history, but it was in the interests of justice and human decency to attempt to restore his good name. More than 50 supporters came together to raise funds to build a tombstone. Today, Joe Arridy rests in Greenwood Cemetery, in Woodpecker Hill, Colorado, the state where he was born.